All right, let's get on into chapter 26, the affluent society. So this chapter is actually kind of named after a book by John Kenneth Galbraith called The Affluent Society. So it examines America's post World War II consumer economy and criticized its focus on increasing production and consumption of luxury goods. He argued that this approach would lead to economic inequality as private interests benefited at the expense of the public. Despite the unprecedented economic growth and improved living standards during this period, Galbraith pointed out fundamental flaws in the affluent society. These included the reproduction of existing inequalities, struggles for equal rights for women, limited access to education, health care, and job opportunities for the poor, the decline of cities, racial discrimination, and environmental destruction. The affluent society was characterized by contradictions, with prosperity coexisting with poverty, technological innovation with social and environmental damage, increased opportunities with entrenched discrimination, and liberation with conformity. So this kind of this dichotomy, this very two-sided, polar opposites on every, at every angle. So one of the things that we've talked in this chapter, we went through a lot of it in good detail in class. So I'll kind of try and speed this one up. So we're talking about the rise of the suburbs. We talked about Levittstown. We talked about how foreclosures, when a bank repossesses property, and how that was crippling the American economy throughout World War II, but right after, you start to see a resurgence of home ownership. So you had programs like the FHA loans, or the HOLC, HOLC, which was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the Fair Housing Act, the FHA loans, to try and bolster Americans, particularly white Americans, towards propelling them towards home ownership. You had Levittown, which really was these cookie cutter homes, tract homes out in the suburbs. Blacks were being excluded. It was started by a man named William Levitt, who, and like I said, so anyone who wasn't white was really largely excluded. They were all over the country. Consumerism was at an all-time high. We really, really were pushing. In fact, an entire new industry called marketing and ads became a new industry. Why? Because you just had television being invented. So with that came a lot of ads. So, families owning cars increased from 54% in 1948 to 74% by 1959. So, we started seeing more television. We started seeing bigger cars, rising wages, wartime savings, newly created installment plans. So all these things, credit, all these things were kind of coming up for, which was contributing to the consumerism. We talked a lot about racial disparities, how Black Americans were considered a bad risk and were barred wholesale from, getting FHA loans or HOLC loans, etc. So the redlining in, communities. So basically, saying this area, this is a bad area because there's a certain percentage of minorities living there, Black or Hispanic. So, we're not going to put any money or resources into these areas, so people were not able to secure loans to fix their homes, to start businesses, none of those things. So that was part of the redlining there. Redlining also has a legacy of redlining, and interestingly enough, it's still going on today. They just start switching it up and then calling it gentrification, where they move the people out of a neighborhood and then revitalize it. But as long as the people are there, meaning minorities in particular are there, then no money can ever come into that community. Or what they'll do is go ahead and if companies start coming in to that neighborhood, then the property values, start to go up, and they basically price the people who live there out of being able to live there. So like their property taxes triple, quadruple, to the point where the people they have to sell, they're forced to sell. So you still see a lot of this type of stuff happening. Okay. Civil rights and housing was a major part of the civil rights fight, because some of the things that we talked about are like project and tenement homes all through different areas. Minorities, and particularly blacks, were relegated to living in slums that they were paying exorbitant amounts of money for, and were again through being denied home loans and things like that, or laws that were in place where if a person who was white had a home and they wanted to sell it, they had signed agreements that they couldn't sell it to anybody other than a white person. So this is all part of what was being done in housing discrimination. Now, we also had several environmental consequences. So with building all of this construction, these suburban communities, they were doing it recklessly, okay, using, quick and dirty methods of doing things, disrupting natural habitats, pollutioning, the pollution in groundwater and well water from all the pesticides and the DDT that they were using to get these beautiful lawns that they were, it was just part of the curb appeal to get people to come and, use their GI Bills coming back from the war to buy these homes. Well, they wanted them to be beautiful and well appointed. So that was some of the problems. Many were equipped with malfunctioning septic tanks, again, polluting, groundwater. Typical post-war tract homes were difficult to cool in the summer and heat in the winter. So there were all kinds of problems that was going on with that. So Rachel Carson actually wrote a book called Silent Spring, which brought attention to the overuse of pesticides like DDT I was mentioning, faucets spouting detergent foams, children swimming in contaminated streams, and just all kinds of other hazards. Okay, so looking at race and education, the separate but equal within education, we know is inherently unequal. So we talked about how in the white neighborhoods, you might have 12 schools, and they had a budget of over $650,000, whereas you had 6 times that, like 60 some odd black schools with a combined budget of less than 200,000. 190 something thousand. So you just see that huge disparity in just the monies that are allocated towards the black schools. So in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education overruled in schools, only in schools, but it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Still did nothing for other areas like, public works and public spaces, but in schools, separate but equal was no longer, okay? Again, building the case against segregation, there was a lot of cases that we saw. Briggs versus Elliott in South Carolina, Davis versus the County School Board of Prince Edward County in Virginia, Beulah versus Belton in Delaware, Balling versus Sharp in Washington, D.C., and then, of course, Brown versus the Board of Education, Kansas City. So these are all cases I would strongly suggest you are familiar. You don't have to know every single detail, but be familiar with these different cases, right? Also, the famous doll experiment of Kenneth and Mamie Clark, where, again, the argument is showing that they were saying that segregation was having a psychological effect on black children. So everything that was good or clean or nice was associated with whiteness, and everything that was dirty and dilapidated and broken was associated with blackness. So in this doll experiment, black children were given the option of playing with one of 2 dolls, a black doll and a white doll. And instead of picking the doll that you would think would be closest to you, choosing the black doll, they almost unanimously chose the white doll. So that was really an example of how, the NAACP used that to really to hone in the fact that separate was inherently unequal. So it was only with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and subsequent court decision that made some progress in enforcing integration. Excuse me. So overall, the Board of Brown versus Board of Education symbolized a turning point in American history, inspiring a social movement against racial segregation. You also had, because again, now this is coming through from World War II, you had what we call the double V campaign. So Black America was looking to get double victory overseas in the war, fighting, for World War II, and then victory at home with obtaining equal rights, respect, and access to the tools that would, lead to upward mobility. And I want to be clear on this. Nobody was asking for handouts. Just, stop punching down on us. That was really what the arguments were. So you had people like Sarah Keyes, long before Rosa Parks, about a decade before Rosa Parks. I'm sorry, not a decade, but a couple years before Rosa Parks, made her grand, sitting down on the bus or whatever, kicking off the bus boycott. You had a young lady named Sarah Keyes who, without any fanfare, did the same thing. And ended up getting, arrested. She sued. So the case Sarah Keyes versus the Carolina Coach Company, and not only landed her in jail in 1953, but it did go into that landmark decision in 1955, right? So which came out and said that the Interstate Commerce Commission ruled that separate but equal violated the Interstate Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Now, let's be clear. Ida B. Wells Barnett had done the very same thing back in the 1800s and had actually won the case she had against the railroads with the same thing. However, that was overturned in her case. Now, moving forward, so you're starting to see more momentum being built where people just aren't taking it anymore. So then there was the case of Emmett Till in 1955. A 14-year-old little boy was drug out of his family's home. He was from Chicago, down south, visiting family, down in Mississippi, and was just horrifically beaten and mutilated. Okay, and the two men got off, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam. They got acquitted. They got off for it. And then they were interviewed later and they were bragging about it. And it had nothing to do with the reason that they said initially that they had used as an excuse to brutalize that baby boy, was that he whistled at a white woman, when in actuality, in their own words, I quote, "They ain't gonna go to school with my kids," Millam said. They wanted to make an example out of Till just so everybody can know how me and my folks stand. So this had nothing to do with him allegedly whistling or looking at some white woman. So the Till case became a permanent memory for the young black men and women to soon propel the civil rights movement forward. Okay, we talked about Rosa Parks. In December of 1955, she refused to give up her seat. But again, this is not organic. Remember, we talked the difference about organic and grassroots. This is not that. Even though Dr. Martin Luther King and some of the other people who were involved in it really were grassroots organic organizations, Rosa Parks, being a member of the Eastern Star, okay, the female wing of the Masons. So there were some some other things that were in play that were propelling this forward. Now, it still got some good, some good results. But again, we're talking about a lot of support and resources that were made available to Rosa and, this initiative from the NAACP, which we talked about before, is backed by the Jewish elite. Okay. Joanne Robinson, so make sure you remember who she is, over the Women's Political Council. That also sparked the Montgomery bus boycotts, which lasted from December 1955 to December of 1956. So exactly 1 year, and the Supreme Court ordered the integration of buses. So there was that. We talked a little bit about Dr. Martin Luther King coming into prominence. This, born in Atlanta. He was educated at the Boston School of Theology. He also became a Baptist minister. Very young man, very eloquent, well-spoken, and well-educated. He married Coretta Scott King, and, he actually was one of the founders, helped to create and run the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, and he was going to be, of course, the face of the civil rights movement from the 50s and into the 60s. You had the Civil Rights Act of 1957, so pressure is building. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which was the first measure of its kind to be passed since Reconstruction. Now, the act, however, was compromised away nearly to nothing. So, of course, they still weren't really going to address the real issues or make any restitution or strides to really, level the playing field for Black Americans. That wasn't going to happen. So what they did do was come up with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Commission. And as we mentioned, when we started looking into that, when you start, under supposed to be like racial discrimination, but what we saw is that this became, a program that helped everybody else except Black Americans. Blacks were still being lynched. They were still, in fact, it had heightened again, back to, levels that they were in the 20s and 30s and coming out of, out of slavery after Reconstruction. So you start seeing all these spikes and all of this, and nothing is being done about that. So this symbolic gesture for having this Department of Justice, again, it really, when you look at its cases that it took on, that it championed, had nothing to do with Black Americans. A year into the Montgomery bus boycott, angry white Southerners bombed an African American church and, churches and their homes, the homes of Dr. King and other civil rights leaders, E.D. Nixon, for example. So, moving on, gender and culture in the affluent society, television, and that's going to be a big one because once again, we know now where we had radio before, we used to have just newspapers, broadsides, magazines. Now, then you had radio. Now you have television. We talked about that, engaging more of the senses. You're seeing it, you're hearing it, and then you're hearing and seeing it repetitiously. So propaganda, this is a major propaganda tool, also solely controlled by the elite, particularly the Jewish elite and the Masons. So nothing is changing. Television was presented to the American public at the New York World's Fair back in 1939, but it didn't really, kind of get off and get into people's home until between 48 and 55. You start seeing almost 2/3 of households now had television sets. So it became, huge. There was a transition, some degree from radio to television. So a lot of your programs that you had, like Milton Berle's Variety, Texaco Star Theater, and many of the shows, the soap operas, all of these things you had in radio just transitioned now to television. Okay, by the mid-1950s, understand that an hour of primetime programming cost about $150,000 to produce. In today's money, that would be $1.5 million to produce that. So in order to offset that, commercials, remember we talked about how an entire new industry post World War II, called marketing and ad agencies, really come into the forefront, and we start seeing the fruit of their labor in that, in on television, because now you're selling radio spots. You had shared TV culture. So mind you, there were only 3 broadcasting networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS, right? So, you had competing television shows, of course, but people either watched one or the other at that time slot. So because of the cost and the difficulty of recording, most programs were broadcast live. And if you ever go back and you look at old shows, you'll see, this show was taped in front of a live studio audience, because at the time that it was broadcast, it was literally broadcasted live. Okay, forcing stations across the country to air shows at the same time. So if you have a time slot of 6 o'clock, it's going to be 6 o'clock in California, but it would be 9 o'clock, say, in New York, right? But they had to broadcast them at the same time. So you had limited channels, which meant that programs had to appeal to wide audiences, and non-controversial shows that idealized the nuclear family and traditional gender roles. So you had a lot of The Little Rascals, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, just all of the, the 1950 programming that, you saw. Now let's talk about the baby boom. Pretty much when Johnny came home from the war in World War II, you had an explosion of childbirth. And there's several factors that go into that. One is from an economic standpoint. Yes, people made more money. Women who had been working, for 3-4 years or whatever in the war industry, they didn't have an opportunity or a way or a place to spend all that money. So a lot of it was just saved up. So when their husbands, they were in a better financial position, once they, married and whatnot, to have large families, to have more children. That was one piece. Also, because of the strides that had been made, the advancements in sanitation, and in healthcare in general, in many ways. So women were not just dying as often in childbirth, and children, babies were able to live to adulthood. So, you had more children, and those more children were living. And that's the big difference, because prior to World War II, people were still having a lot of children, but at the end of the day, all of your children weren't going to live to adulthood. Okay. So that changed. So that's what was known as the baby boom in the 1940s, which is the time period from 1946 to 1964. So between that time period, the boom was on. Okay, that 18-year period skyrocketed children. All right. Let's see here. Youth culture. Now that people had a little bit more money, children were not, being whisked off to, to work at the tender ages of 6 and 7 or whatever, or as young teenagers, what we call young teens, 13, 14, 15 years old, like we saw with the Lowell Mill girls and things earlier in the, like the 1800s, and even all through, young women having to go out and work like at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company that unfortunately got burned down. So, the point is they're not having to do that. So what do you do with young people now? There is a new culture. So for the very first time, there is this focus or this invention of childhood, and something else is being invented called the teenager. Okay. And the teenager was going to then gravitate towards rock and roll. So raised in increasing affluence or wealth, yet increasingly unsatisfied with their comfortable lives, American youth began to embrace rebellion, rock and roll. You had Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, and he was, all the rage, right? So music is changing. And then you have television as well. So where people may have thought some things, prior to, it's a difference when you're able to actually see it. If you had back in the 30s and 40s listened to some of the music, it was played on the radio, that would have been kind of one thing to listen to, Elvis, blue suede shoes, you just listen to the music, right? And you can kind of rock out and dance to the music. But when you get to see him and he's thrusting and gyrating his hips in a very lascivious manner, well, that's taking things to an entirely different level. Then you had the beatniks. So the beatniks, their generation kind of tried to seek out this deeper meaning of life by rejecting capitalism and traditional gender roles. And that's kind of the overall term, which really was about sex, drugs, and and even in the sex, homosexuality or promiscuity. So where the traditional norms would have been for a young lady to wait until she was married, or at least close to marriage, before, letting her fortress be breached. Now it's, let's try as many partners as possible. And the same thing with men, with a lot of the men, they weren't just trying all kinds of different women. They were also experimenting with same gender, sexual activity. So drugs, sex, and then art form was also coming out. So you had people like Kerouac, who wrote the book On the Road. You also had people like Allen Ginsberg and so forth, who were contributing to a lot of that. You saw, and because of that, you started to see more gay rights movement. There was the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. So make sure you are familiar with those. That was a gay and lesbian, kind of support groups out of San Francisco. Well, the Mattachine Society was actually Los Angeles, and then the Daughters of Bilitis was out of San Francisco. So they were kind of starting to want to push themselves and their lifestyle to try and have that normalized. And that they were in the beginning stages of that at this time. So politics and ideology in the affluent society, the post-war economic prosperity and suburban growth in America influenced politics, leading to a renewed belief in capitalism, cultural conservatism, and religion. So we actually saw a lot of that. There's also another party called the Libertarians. So make sure that you take a good look at them. So the Libertarians did kind of took it to its core principle, the promotion of individual liberties, property rights, and an economy with a minimum of government regulation. So to be honest, the Libertarian Party was kind of right between the middle between the conservative viewpoint of the Republicans and the ultra-liberal viewpoint of the Democrats. So they were taking sort of the social politics of, it's okay, be tolerant, all of that, it's live and let live, kind of from the social standpoint from the Democrats, but still a very conservative financial or economic base like the Republicans. Okay. So be familiar with that. You start to see church and economics. So the suburban communities influenced by libertarian politics and evangelical religion became a breeding ground for a new conservative constituency. So you start to see, kind of conservatism beginning to rise on one hand, in a lot of ways to combat what a lot of people were concerned would happen if some of this liberal ideology was to go on unchecked. Okay, so you had novelist Ayn Rand, whose novels The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged were two of the decade's bestsellers. They also helped to move the ideas of individualism or rational self-interest and the virtue of selfishness to those in the suburbs. So even though you're pushing more conservatism again on the financial standpoint, but you're embracing things on the left, right? Republicans became divided. So take a look at how the Republican Party, was faced with some internal divisions between the conservatives and the moderates. Okay, so some wanting to push back some of those New Deal plans. General Dwight Eisenhower joined the 1952 presidential race to prevent the conservatives from taking over the party. So they wanted to stay kind of more moderate, which really is libertarian, to be honest. So take a look at that. Also, Eisenhower, his legislative proposals forced opposition from both conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. So he was kind of getting a little bit of opposition on both sides. And there's some things that are exampled in there, so make sure you take a look at that. But by the end of his presidency, Ike's domestic legislative achievements were largely limited to expanding Social Security, making health, education, and welfare a cabinet position. So Hugh, H-E-W, became an actual position, and passing the National Defense Education Act and bolstering federal support to education, particularly in math and science. Right? So Eisenhower definitely had his own legacy. So take a look at his Soviet policy, etc. Make sure you're familiar with those. So in conclusion, the post-war American consensus initially brought prosperity and a sense of national pride. However, this prosperity was accompanied by growing contradictions, dissent, discrimination, and inequality. As a result, the affluent society became unstable and on the brink of a revolution. So throughout this entire time period, through the coming out of World War II into the 50s, we start seeing, people were, I guess, restless and bored, because prior to, the post-World War II era, people were all working to survive. So it was all hands on deck. Husbands and wives stayed together out of necessity. Children, everybody else had to work for the good of the family. So there was no such thing as your childhood, you're a teenager, my rights as a woman. It really wasn't about that, or all about me as the man. No, for everybody's survival, all hands were on deck. Now that it's more affluent, and you're not, you've got gadgets to help with the housework and all kinds of new technologies, new industries, new jobs, new stuff to buy. It's like, well, what else can we get into? And I guess the old saying that an idle mind is the devil's workshop proves to be true, because now what do you do with that additional time? You've got young people becoming very, very restless and starting, to rebel against traditional social values. So a lot of those things have an effect on where we are today. So that's where we are. That is chapter 26, The Affluent Society. We'll be back in just a moment with chapter 27. Bye-bye.